to this event this afternoon, defining ecocide, how and why should environmental destruction be criminalised? I'd just like to say a few words by way of background before we launch into the presentations. I first came across the concept of ecocide in 2010. It's certainly not a new concept, but in fact it goes back a lot further than that, probably something like over 4 decades. I read that it was first referred to in 1970 by an American biologist called Arthur Goldstone, who was involved in making the chemical component of Agent Orange in the 1950s, which was then subsequently used in the Vietnam War to defoliate vegetation and to poison communities on a very grand scale. Now, Arthur Goldstone was appalled at the use of his own creation. I became a very strong anti-war activist and referred to the large-scale destruction of the ecosystem at the time as ecocide. The term, I think, then was used again in the 1970s at a conference in Sweden, a UN conference on the human environment, which led ultimately to the Stockholm Declaration. And that was the first legal instrument to refer to the right to a healthy environment, which has then subsequently gone on to be incorporated into other instruments like the Aarhus Convention. The 1970s and 1980s saw much debate around the reference to ecocide in the UN around the 1948 Genocide Convention, with several countries advocating for the inclusion of ecocide in that convention. However, as I understand it, there was a lot of pressure from the nuclear lobby, amongst other places, and all references to ecocide were removed from the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Now, as I say, I first came across the term in 2010 when the late Polly Higgins was advocating for the introduction of a legal duty of care for the natural environment and for ecocide to be made an international crime alongside genocide, crimes of aggression, crimes against humanity and war crimes. And Polly continued to campaign tirelessly for that aim until 2019. Turning to our event today, in November 2020, the Stop Ecocide Foundation convened a panel of international lawyers to draft a legally enforceable definition of ecocide. The panel is co-chaired by barrister, academic and writer Philippe QC and Senegalese jurist Dior Fall Sow. The project aims to have the destruction of ecosystems recognised as a crime of the greatest magnitude. Drafting is underway, and as I understand it, we're due to have the publication of a definition in early 2021. Our speakers today are going to explore why there's an urgent need for a legal framework, the current status of rights of nature, and the history of the long and numerous campaigns to have ecocide recognised as a crime. And urgent action couldn't be more needed, with 34 countries declaring a climate emergency. Yet despite this, government, corporations, and dare I even say the judiciary, remain resistant to meaningful change. So we now have 3 very interesting speakers joining us today to explore this subject from slightly different viewpoints. We have Sir Crispin Agnew QC, Esther Stanford Cossé, and Jojo Mehta. We're going to first start with Sir Crispin. Sir Crispin is an honorary research fellow at the University of Dundee. He was in the practice at the Scottish Bar until April 2020, specialising in rural property and environmental law. He's a trained mediator and the author of law books and articles in peer-reviewed journals. Before taking up law, he was involved in various scientific and mountaineering expeditions to Greenland, the Antarctic, the Chilean Andes, and the Himalayas, hence his interest in environmental law. He's a past patron of UKELA and a member of the UKELA Wild Law Group with a special interest in the rights of nature. And he was also a trustee of the John Muir Trust for 16 years. And as I was reminding him a few moments ago, we first met nearly 30 years ago when I was working for WWF, and we instructed him to help us on a case to stop a funicular railway going up the side of the Cairngorm. Now, sadly, as we just discussed, we lost that, but we did go on to be, or the point went on to be considered at the European Court, and we were proven right in law, at least if nothing else, in Scottish courts. So it's with no further ado that I'd like to hand over to Sir Crispin to give us our first presentation. Thank you.
Carol, thank you very much for asking me to join in with this seminar on ecocide, which is a matter of considerable interest. The point I really want to discuss is ecocide in the UK, because really it's being viewed as an international crime, and the two other speakers are going to deal with that. It's really, although a definition has to come, it's the mass damage and destruction of ecosystems. Now, there's no ecocide offence in the UK, and this is really because our environmental laws go back to the concept that everything is a matter of property rights, and either you own the environment in which you're living, you own the estate, you own the land, and so everything is geared towards that ownership and limiting that ownership when it's appropriate in different ways. The great weakness of not having an ecocide offence is it fails to exploit the fact that the whole world is integrated. You know, humans are merely part of the environmental system. We are merely one animal in the range, albeit we have a more devastating impact than necessarily other animals do. But when you start off with protecting property rights, you then link that to protecting human rights and protecting people. So what we find is we have licensing for damaging activities. You permit the damaging activities subject to licensing, subject to conditions. You get that in the planning and a whole range of other systems. We then set about protecting parts of the environment. There are not enough eagles around, so we protect the eagles. There are not enough this or that around, so we protect them. We protect badgers, not because there are too many, but we protect them to stop the criminal activity of badger baiting and so on. Or we try to protect human health with the Air Acts and so on. So that's the background against which we're working. And it's the background which rights of nature movement wants to overcome. The rights of nature really is the recognition that nature has rights. It's a recognition that our ecosystem, our trees, oceans, animals have rights just as much as humans. Although I know the various attempts to get a chimpanzee rights failed, and there have been various other attempts like that. And in a way, the rights of nature concept goes back to the judgment of Mr. Justice Douglas in the Supreme Court of the United States in 1972, where the Sierra Club tried to stop a skiing development in the Sierra Nevada Mountains National Park. And it was held that they had no standing because they had no property rights that were injured and they had no individual rights that were injured. But he said there was no reason why, just like the fiction of a company having a personality or a ship having a personality, that the law shouldn't give natural features such as rivers, mountains, lakes, and so on, a personality so that they could litigate. And he went on to say that the people who used those facilities, who walked in the natural environment, were the ones should have title and interest to sue. So the interesting thing was he had been a director of the Sierra Club while he was a justice of the Supreme Court, so it might have raised issues of bias these days. And it's really from there that things have gone on. And you now have movements to give personality to rivers. It's been done statutorily in New Zealand, where it's recognized the Maori connection with some of the rivers. It's been put into statute and set up a whole management regime. Same with the Yarrow River in Australia, in Victoria. It's been given an act of parliament to protect it and given it a legal personality. It's been done through the courts. In India, the Indian courts are given the River Ganges a personality. A recent Bengali decision decided that all rivers in Bangladesh have a personality. and have said that various people should protect them. The same in Colombia. There's been an action recently in the United States to try to raise the issue, but the state attorney said that if they proceeded with it as it was a frivolous action, he would be seeking damages and disbarring of the counsel who was participating in the application. So that's the developing rights of nature movement. Perhaps the high point is the Global Alliance for Rights of Nature, which have produced the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth. And that calls for the UN to adopt it as a declaration. Its cry is Mother Earth, about Mother Earth, considering we are all parts of Mother Earth, an indivisible living community of interrelated and independent beings with a common destiny. So that's trying to recognize that humans are merely but part of this wider Earth system. It goes on to say, Mother Earth and all beings of which she is composed have the following inherent rights: the right to life and to exist, the right to be respected, the right to regenerate its biocapacity, the right to maintain its identity and integrity as a distinct, self-regulating and interrelated being. Now, how does COVID fit into that? It's a being, it has a right to life, it has a right to regenerate, and so on. And yet we are going out of our way to eradicate COVID. So there is a tension as to how you balance the different rights. You know, there's the right of the lion and the right of the buffalo, but nature, one's the food for the other, and there is a balance there, which I think one has to take into account. But it's a concept that it's not just humans and their property and their dominance which has all the rights. It's very much we should take into account every natural right. Now that's a sort of background to the rights of nature movement, and if one does adopt a concept, then ecocide fits into that quite well. But in the UK, we protect the environment in what I call the salami style. Nowadays, it's mainly EU law, just and still, but EU law really superseded similar British acts. For example, there's a Birds Protection Act of the 1880s, River Protection Acts go back to the 1950s, control of the Clean Air Act of 1956, and so on. These have all effectively been replaced by EU law, but they're all dealing with particular issues: protection of the water environment, Groundwater Directive, Water Framework Directive, protection of birds, Birds Directive, protection of species and habitats, Habitats Directive, contaminated land, pollution prevention and control for industries, the recent Clean Air Act. So they're all those regimes. We then have the permissive regimes. You can't do any development without planning permission. You can't do waste management without a waste management license. So everything is there, and all the offences are linked to those particular regimes. There are breaches of the protection regime. There are doing things without a license. There are offences of not complying with the conditions in a license. And everything is narrowed down to the particular legislation and the particular ill that you're trying to affect. But there's no overarching recognition that everything is interlinked. And I think that overarching system is needed with an overarching offense, because if you just do the salami approach prosecutions, then it's you prosecute for polluting the river, but you don't prosecute for the wider impact that that pollution has on interlinking ecosystems. You know, you kill the one, the one fish, or you kill so many fish in the river, but the lack of the fish, what impact does that then have on all the bugs and the microbes and all the rest? And going further out, many of the impacts we don't appreciate or realize. So what I think is we need a greater recognition of the importance of ecosystems. And this is coming about to an extent in the academic field, where people are trying to value ecosystem services. These are the services that provide benefits by the ecosystem that contribute really to the making of human life possible and worth living, and which supports the whole other human, animal, reptile, the whole life cycle of the areas. You know, put beavers and beaver dams in rivers, and it cleans the water, it helps with flood prevention. The outdoors is great for recreational benefits, spiritual benefits. John Muir, the great environmentalist, talked of, in every walk with nature, one receives far more than he seeks. So Britain doesn't recognize this overarching effect, doesn't recognize the rights of nature, doesn't recognize that the environment is part of a whole, and so it doesn't give that protection. I think we need an ecocide type overarching offense where there's been a substantial damage to a whole ecosystem. And you don't need to specify, well, you damage the fish, you damage the birds, you damage this, that, and the other. Quite difficult to draft it, but one can perhaps take an idea once we get an international definition. There are signs of people using the European Human Rights Court. We've got the recent Portuguese children's challenge to climate change and the fact that nations are not taking an approach to it. That's sort of approaching ecocide, but it's ecocide for the protection of humans. It's not for the protection of nature as a whole. There's the Welsh case, sort of Welsh Act, whose name just escapes me, which gives protection for future generations, which is edging towards it. So at the moment, we're rather restricted in what we can do to protect the environment. Everything is done by the state in the prosecution and so on. And if you try to challenge the system or try to raise an action against it, somebody holds up their hands and says Wednesbury, and you're bound to fail. So thank you. That's my views on ecocide in UK.
Thank you very much, Sir Crispin. I certainly echo some of those latter thoughts you made there. Very interesting to get the UK perspective. We're going to move on to our second speaker now. This is Esther Stanford-Jose. Esther is a jurist, consultant and community advocate specialising in the critical legal practice of law as resistance. She serves as the co-vice chair of the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe, PARCO, and she's the coordinator general of the Stop the Maangalizi We Charge Genocide Ecocide campaign. She's also co-facilitator of the International Network of Scholars and Activists for African Reparations. And in addition, Esther is a co-founder of Extinction Rebellion Internationalist Solidarity Network and a trustee of Plan B, which supports strategic legal action against climate change. With that, I hand over to you, Esther. Thank you.
You're still on mute, Esther.
Sorry, thank you. Right, get right to it. So speaking particularly on behalf of PARCO and the Stop the Maangalizi campaign today. And of course, we are in support of the campaign to criminalise ecocide, environmental destruction. So we see this as necessary and timely, long overdue, but also as we recognise it as a reformist measure. We do, though, agree that there is a need for such an international crime of ecocide that can prosecute perpetrators for acts of ecocide. And we think it's also important to recognise ecocidally induced physical and cultural genocide under the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. And in this regard, it's important to recognise that such legal mechanisms of redress should also take on board what's known as the genocide ecocide nexus. And that is the idea that ecocide, in terms of the large scale destruction of natural ecosystems, can, and actually in many instances, does amount to acts of genocide, also in terms of the attempts in whole or in part to destroy particular groups. And we recognise the notion of cultural ecocide, which I believe also is championed by the Stop Ecocide campaign. So why this is important is because environmental devastation often functions like a slow genocide, eroding not only nature and that which sustains all life, but also the health of the people that live in particular environments. It not only erodes the health of peoples, but it erodes the sovereignty of peoples, and it also erodes our natural kind of earth systems, all of which are not separate from people, but they are integral to a group's identity, particularly Indigenous peoples, African peoples, and other peoples who have experienced colonization. And we must remember that Dr. Raphael Lemkin, the founder of genocide, the notion of genocide today, also stated that genocide has two phases. One, the destruction of the natural pattern of the oppressed group, the other being the imposition of the national pattern of the oppressor. So I say that to say that the whole system that we live in today is as a result largely of colonization. And that has meant particular things for particular groups of people. And so Indigenous peoples have been denied sovereignty, just as many of us as African heritage communities have been denied sovereignty. And when we were, exercising our own sovereignty, we recognized that ecocide was a crime, okay, according to our own laws. And this is necessary if we're looking at not only the history of ecocide recognition, but what has happened that has changed that sort of order of the day in terms of the global majority to a situation now where we have this piecemeal approach, or this salami approach that Sir Crispin has just referred to. And in the cultures of Indigenous peoples, the environment has a cultural and a spiritual significance. And so what we are today describing as ecocide, if we go to the root of that in terms of deriving from the Greek oikos, meaning house or home, and the Latin sedere, meaning to strike down, demolish or kill, literally the killing of our home has been recognized for centuries. But why this isn't kind of mainstream is because much of the world is still experiencing forms and degrees of coloniality. And so part of the solution of how we recognize ecocide must be to actually engage in whole-scale decolonization, not in the very tokenistic, metaphoric way that decolonization is kind of bandied about today, but decolonization in terms of the restoration of people's identity and vicegerency or custodianship over land and our Mother Earth, so that we can actually live in harmony again and not engage in forms of extractivism that have largely been instituted as a result of colonization. So this is very key from our own perspective. And certainly the Stop the Ma'angamizi, which has We Charge Genocide and Ecocide attached to it, starts from this premises that we, in order before we can repair the harm, we have to stop the ongoing harm. So we can't separate this need for true decolonization and a restoration of that which has been lost or denied or denigrated. We can't separate that from the notion of reparatory justice, which we very much champion. And this is so relevant to ecocide recognition. So reparatory justice, in terms of the notion of reparations, is not just about financial compensation, which is what you often hear about today. It's often reduced to that. But it involves, even under current so-called international law, whole-scale measures, wide measures, such as restitution. And we see that the restitution of sovereignty in that vein. It includes rehabilitation. It includes measures of satisfaction, guarantees of non-repetition, and it also includes measures of compensation. So that is the key. And going forward, we believe, and we are actually organising in that space that is often left out of these discourses around legal reform and implementation, and in fact the making of law, which is the space of social movements and the role of communities in resistance. And social movements, if we're talking about, you know, forming the critical mass to be able to affect wide-scale change, including changes in the law, we cannot discount the role of movements in this regard. And in that regard, a large part of our work, which is about reparations, is also about ensuring that people can build their power and use their own legal consciousness and their own legal systems and justice systems to actually bring about the changes in law as well. And that would include recognition of what such communities have known for centuries. And in fact, we all owe them a great debt in terms of reminding us as the rest of humanity as to the harm that we are complicit in, but also the responsibilities that we have to be part of the repair. And so what we promote, working through structures, and this is in particular the Stop the Ma'angamizi campaign that co-founded the Extinction Rebellion Internationalist Solidarity Movement. We're championing the notion of global citizens' assemblies, where we can have alternative forms of decision-making that are participatory, democratic, and actually engage the citizenries in coming to decisions about how not only they govern their lives, but also how we recognize the rights of our Mother Earth and implement those. And tied to that is the notion of people's tribunals as civil society tribunals that engage in alternative forms of lawmaking, law implementation, and evaluation of the law. So those are the points that I wanted to make in terms of how we relate to this issue of criminalising ecocide and the importance of it for those communities who are seeking to be part of the restoration of not only ourselves, but also ensuring that we can go back to living in harmony with our Mother Earth, which collectively we refer to as planet repairs. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. That was really interesting, and I hope we can return to some of those themes in the Q&A, because I think it's really valuable to see how these different perspectives come together. My experience from campaigning is that it's very rare to achieve something with just one part of an audience. You know, it's really the concerted action of lots of people in different ways working together with a common objective that can achieve the end. So that was really helpful. Thank you. Can we pass over then to our final speaker, who is Jojo Mehta? Jojo is she co-founded the Stop Ecocide campaign in 2017, alongside barrister and legal pioneer, the late Polly Higgins, to support the establishment of ecocide as a crime at the ICC. Jojo coordinates between the fast-growing international campaign and the lawyers, advocates, and parliamentarians engaged in the core work of progressing the crime. She's the chair of the board of the Stop Ecocide Foundation in the Netherlands, which now manages the campaign, and the convener of the independent expert panel for the legal definition of ecocide. We very much look forward to hearing what you're going to say, Jojo. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here, and it's a privilege to be in the company of these speakers, and just wonderful to meet all of you. I'd like to kind of firstly just give a very brief background to the foundation and campaign, and then go into why it is that we pursue the particular legal route we do, which, as Carol just said, is that of amending international law to add ecocide as an international crime at the ICC. So this campaign was founded by myself and Polly Higgins in 2017, and Polly by that time had been working on, expanding knowledge around the world of this concept of ecocide and promoting diplomatic developments around it already for several years. I worked with her very closely for the last 4.5 years of her life. She's sadly no longer with us. And we founded the campaign, the public-facing campaign, in part because this move to criminalise ecocide was seen as quite sort of left field and quite extreme by the sort of funding foundations that might otherwise have been supporting kind of environmental projects and so on. It was seen as a kind of high-risk thing to put your support into, and also a little tricky to give milestones easily. When the work that you're doing is essentially diplomatic and often confidential, it was quite difficult to sort of stand up in front of a whole, perhaps a table of funders and explain where you'd got to, because you actually weren't able to do that because it was confidential. So there was this situation where we were moving forward with this work, but it was very difficult to fund. On the other hand, what Polly had very inspirationally done was pioneer the concept, not because she invented it, but because she kind of resurrected it, I suppose would be a good way of describing it, and had a very broad following internationally across all sectors of society. And so the campaign initially was a kind of, let's actually appeal to the crowd who are in support of this, and let's crowdfund the diplomatic work. Now, what's been very interesting in the developments since that time is realizing the importance of what Esther was actually just bringing up, which is that it's not just about potentially sourcing resources in order to move the diplomatic conversation forward. It's realizing that the campaigning side and the public narrative and the movements on the ground actually have a direct effect on political progress. And so we now find ourselves as a foundation in this interesting position where we're kind of in between, if you like, the legal developments, which obviously manifest currently in terms of this expert drafting panel that we've convened, with the diplomatic traction, the kind of ongoing conversation with parliamentarians from many different countries, and also the public narrative. And I think we've seen in particular, I think France is an interesting example of this. We've seen that when you do consult the grassroots, as the French government did with their Citizens' Climate Assembly, what you find is a very strong response towards criminalising destruction of nature. So I think that's a very concrete example of exactly what Esther was just describing. So I'm just going to go into a few points around the practical advantages of the route that we're taking in terms of aiming at the ICC. So firstly, the International Criminal Court is the only global mechanism that directly accesses the criminal justice systems of its member states. So if you criminalise something at the International Criminal Court, you're not necessarily needing to create a separate court or tribunal or a new treaty. What you're doing is you're potentially adding a crime to a list whereby any country that ratifies it must also include it in their own domestic legislation, which they have to do a year after they ratify it at the ICC. So what you're accessing in that circumstance is a kind of the potential of creating a coherent rule that applies across borders. And that's very important, obviously, in the context of serious pollution events and so on, because they are mostly triggered by transnational corporations who operate in many jurisdictions. And so while, of course, we would encourage any nation to legislate for ecocide in its own right, a kind of piecemeal approach is potentially could take a lot longer and be harder to pin down in terms of the applicability across borders. And so for that sort of very practical reason, the ICC is an obvious route, and this is something that Polly spotted quite early on. The other aspect is that, you know, that there are certain procedures that have to be followed in order to amend the Rome Statute, which is the governing document of the international crimes. And that takes a certain amount of time. So there's the initial stage of proposal, where a member state must propose an amendment to the statute, or it could be a group of states, and that's ideally what the sort of premise on which we're working. And then there's a kind of admissibility stage, which is the second stage, where the assembly of this to agree that, yes, we're going to put this on the table, this is now, you know, sort of open for discussion. And so that's a very key stage. And what's really is sort of exciting about these early parts is that any state can put it on the table. It doesn't have to be necessarily one of the world's larger economies. It can also be, for example, one of the climate vulnerable small island states that our campaign started out working with, who have very obvious incentives to move forward with criminalising activities which can exacerbate climate change. And the other aspect of the ICC is that, you know, like the UN, it's a one state, one vote situation, but unlike the UN, it doesn't have a Security Council, and there is no single country that has a veto. So once the amendment proposal is agreed to, once it's agreed that it's on the table, there's no one that can remove it. Effectively, you're then talking about an accumulation of support. So that's quite a sort of exciting kind of procedural arena to be stepping into with this new crime. The other thing, of course, is that there is a breadth of enforcement that can come with the ICC that people often don't necessarily realise to begin with. The ICC has not taken many prosecutions over its life itself, but of course its founding principle is that of complementarity. So the idea with the International Criminal Court is that it steps in when national jurisdictions can't or won't deal with, their own criminal justice systems won't deal with crime. Now, if you're a war criminal, quite conceivably, your own state isn't going to prosecute you. And so you will end up in the court of last resort. However, with ecocide, we're mostly talking about a corporate crime. And although, of course, there are many state-sponsored corporations and state-subsidized corporations, which are highly polluting, the corporations themselves and those who run them can potentially be prosecuted in any jurisdiction that ratifies the crime. And under universal jurisdiction principles, the perpetrator doesn't have to be from the country in which the prosecution is taking place, and neither does the crime itself. So what this does is it creates a breadth of possibilities for actually enforcing mention around the procedure that takes place. So you then move on, once the amendment's on the table, you move on to the process of negotiation and adoption, which could take some time, but it requires a 2/3 majority at least to actually pass and get the law adopted into the statute, after which ratification can take place. Now, all of this obviously will take some time. The last time that the Rome Statute was amended, the crime of aggression, I mean, depending on where you start the sort of process, sort of took between 7 and 10 years to incorporate into the statute. Now, actually, in the current climate, both political and literal, we consider that ecocide has the potential to move rather faster, because I believe there's a growing awareness around the world that we have a really relatively short time in which to turn the planetary ship around, because sorry, I just had to restart my video there. Yes, because this decade between now and 2030 has, from many angles, been described as absolutely decisive in terms of being able to take the kinds of action and change the kinds of practices, extractive practices and destructive practices that our economies engage in, if we wish to have a chance of preventing, passing too many of these tipping points that have been identified around climate, some of which we are already approaching, and some of which it could even be argued to have been passed. And so there is now a political atmosphere where it's very clear, and we see criminalizing ecocide, in other words, putting it below this kind of moral red line that we use criminal law to draw, is very, very important, because it actually creates a whole, it creates a shift in our attitude. And that goes back to what Sir Crispin was saying about, you know, the sort of attitude that we have, that we're somehow separate to nature. Actually putting a crime of ecocide alongside crimes against people goes some way to kind of beginning to rebalance that perspective, and that's very important. But also it will take time for both nations and the corporate world to shift their practices, and seeing something like this coming over the horizon is a very powerful incentive, and potentially a very powerful deterrent, and a sort of spur to changing attitudes. So just briefly looking at where we've got to in terms of political progress with this work, we now have 8 governments worldwide that have recorded an interest of varying degrees in this criminalization of ecocide at the international level, which is hugely encouraging. And that has developed in less than 18 months. So since December 2019, in fact, that's just over a year, really, that conversation has escalated from Vanuatu in the Maldives being the first to call for it at the ICC, to support from President Macron of France, incorporation in the Belgian government's pledges, support from the Finnish Foreign Minister, from the Spanish Parliamentary Committee on Foreign Affairs, and also indication of interest from Canada and from Luxembourg in closely following this conversation. Beyond that, we have a further 11 countries, of which parliamentarians are specifically interested in seeing and reviewing the definition that is going to be emerging in June, a little later, in fact, than we originally predicted, definition drafting panel. And so, as you can see, that's a huge acceleration in terms of the global conversation. And I think I would also like to come back again to something that Esther talked about in terms of the importance of social movements here, because we've seen a huge sea change in attention on this subject and in political interest in it over the last 18 months. And we credit that in large part to the climate mobilizations that we've seen on the streets. And, you know, to the Sunrise Movement, to Extinction Rebellion, to the school strikes, to Stop the Mangamese, to all of these on the ground grassroots movements that have elevated this conversation and that have created a sort of a stretching of the window, which of media discussion and of political discussion. And what that's done is it's opened up the conversation to the extent that, you know, this term and this concept of ecocide, which perhaps seemed a little extreme a few years ago, are now appearing far more logical, and that word is now starting to land, and people are starting to hear it in a way that wasn't, you know, that hasn't been the case over the previous decade. So that's actually very exciting. And I think the one thing that is worth coming back to here in terms of the public narrative is that the word itself is very powerful. So the word and concept of ecocide have a kind of resonance where people might be aware of damage happening in all sorts of areas of nature, whether that's deforestation, whether that's air pollution, whether that's overfishing, and many others. But this concept of ecocide brings that all together in the sense of creating an understanding of this is a level of damage that is simply unacceptable. This is a level of destruction that is unacceptable. It's all serious damage to nature. And of course, as soon as one understands that word, there is also the understanding that it's wrong and that it must be stopped. And so, you know, it has this kind of bridging potential of sort of moving our consciousness and our ways of thinking from this extractivist, colonialist, harmful attitude to nature to a harmonious one. And so, you know, we feel it's, you know, we're not under any illusion that a law of ecocide will fix all the world's wrongs, but we also see it as essential to moving forward to enable so many other changes that need to happen to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jojo. You managed to pack an enormous amount in there, and I'm sorry that we may have actually had to switch your camera off there because the quality of the call went at some point, but I think we got most of what you said, which was great. That's the sort of three presentations. I just thought we'll just go in and see in terms of, oh, lots of questions. Okay, right. Question here from Henry Addy Topping. Hi guys, this overarching rights of nature Sir Crispin talked of, recognising the environment as a whole. It sounds similar to the progressive but largely overlooked notion of common security that exists within security studies and amongst progressive circles. This conceptual move hasn't been very successful globally, predominantly as national security is far more logically entrenched in war system and nationalist sentiment. So how might implementing the criminalisation of ecocide, particularly in the UK, serve to deprogram and recode the way people, particularly people in property development or infrastructure planning, serve to address the issues of environmental degradation, if conceptually similar missions have fallen short of instigating behavioural or cultural shifts in the past? Okay, I think that probably is firstly directed at Sir Crispin, but obviously if anybody else would like to come in, is that okay?
Yes, happy to answer that. We've talked about ecocide as a crime, but perhaps I should have emphasized more that I think we want rights of nature as the civil side of things. And so that when you talk about planning guidelines, planning policies, and all that sort of thing, they should be written in the context of the whole and the rights of nature and so on as being, in a way, the predominant, rather than at the moment where it's property rights, people want to exploit them, they get planning permission to do it under conditions. So the ecocide criminalizing sort of mass damage is really just part the end where you're trying to educate people to have rights of nature at the forefront of really the whole governmental system. I use planning in the loosest sense of managing our affairs. And in a way, when a government decides to do something, it should have regard to the fact that they're interfering with the rights of nature and not just particular individual things. It does link in with security, yes, because I think our next wars are going to be about water and things like that. And the security of life and living and of nature, the desertification in Africa, spreading south from the Sahara, is endangering huge ecosystems and the people who live in them. And it's all that sort of side of things which you've got to change the mindset. And that will have to be on the civil side, and the ecocide crime is there in the background, if you like, as the stick, when you really need to deal with it as the carrot.
That's very interesting. Would anybody else like to come in on that, Jojo or Esther? No, not particularly. Okay. Okay, there's another one which is quite
just
a
brief
nice
word on the kind of relationship.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Sorry, I missed that. Sorry, okay. I'm just going to go to another question if that's okay, but do scream if I miss something there. How can we in the UK have
I think my internet is a little bit. I think my internet is lagging a little bit, so my apologies. I was only giving. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Jojo. I think we're having problems with your connection, and I'm sure you probably wanted to come in on that. Would have been good to have your view, but hopefully, perhaps we can come back to you in a moment if that's okay. We have another question here. How can we in the UK have an impact in raising these issues with our local council or elected officials? That's from Daniel Davidson. I don't know whether anybody, again, I'm sure there's Sir Crispin might have a view on that, but it would be, I don't know, Esther, if you'd have anything to say about that as well.
Yeah, I do actually, because at the moment, the Stop the Mangamese campaign has been working with the Green Party and the International Network of Scholars and Activists for African Reparations on a reparations motion that recognises ecocide as well as genocide as it has impacted on African heritage communities. And in fact, in October, the whole Green Party at their Green Conference endorsed this notion. And so there is a campaign currently happening across the country where we are working with elected officials, cross-party, including Labour Party members, to pass motions at local councils that would enable not only elected officials, but councils, and of course, to shape policy around these questions at the local level. And we don't separate the genocide from the ecocide. And what we're talking about is legacies on communities and recognizing that communities are global. So many of us are originally from the global south. We are connected to the issues that are happening back home, wherever home is. And we are very much impacted by the continued despoilation, not only of our environment, but of lands, and of course, dispossession of peoples. So that is one bottom-up process that is already happening, that is unprecedented in the world. And I think that it definitely deserves a lot of study and support.
And Esther, are you getting, sorry, just I'll come to you, Crispin, are you getting traction for that from other councillors, not just Green Party, but from other parties as well?
Labour Party, so there's been motions in London. We have had an attempt to pass motion at the Greater London Assembly. In Bristol, they're going to be passing the motion on the 2nd of March. We're talking to councillors in Liverpool. Other city councils are also taking up this issue. So it is gaining traction, definitely.
Fantastic. Sorry, Sir Crispin, I cut across you.
Yes, I agree that one wants to work from the local level upwards as well. Unfortunately, the local level are to an extent constrained, again, by government policies, government guidance, and things like that. So one does need to work at the upper national level, but there can be a lot of pressure from the lower level moving up. For example, Frome Town Council are investigating a bylaw to give the River Frome a personality within their area, and they've proposed it. There's details of it on the website. So that's an interesting change. If there's an article by Mr. David Boyd recognizing the rights of nature, which has a long list of United States corporations, or which are, I think they're district areas, who've all passed local ordinances giving rights of nature to particular aspects of their area. So it is something that is coming up from ground roots as well. And I think that is very important, but you need a top-down and a bottom-up approach.
Very much so. Now, Jojo, this question I think is definitely for you. So we have got your camera turned off, I think, but hopefully if you can hear, you'll be able to come in on this. Okay. If and when ecocide becomes a recognised crime in the ICC, would you be able to use it retrospectively to prosecute for actions and omissions by corporates in the past, i.e. before it was ratified? I hope you can hear, Jojo. Would you like to come in on that? I think we may have lost connection with her.
I can indeed. Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you.
Oh no. I'm actually still here, but I don't think you can hear me.
We can hear you. Can you hear us?
Okay, stay with me because there is a bit of a delay. The simple answer to that question, possibly disappointingly, is no, it won't act retrospectively. So it won't act retrospectively for simple reasons of the rule of law. I mean, if somebody were to suddenly legislate that, you know, some particular action is criminal that never has been criminal, and try to apply it retrospectively, that could involve a huge amount of injustice. So actually, no, it isn't possible to do it retrospectively, but it is also important that it can't be done retrospectively. And one of the reasons for this is that corporates, I mean, if this became law tomorrow, for example, it would be complete chaos. There wouldn't be the ability to sort of deal with this new rule overnight. And also, in many countries, there are kind of ecocidal extractive practices that are also underpinning economies and hence livelihoods. And so there has to be a transition period in order to bring everybody with us, in order to create a goal that people can reach for with a kind of time limit or a compliance period on it, so that we can actually have corporate practice as a whole change and enable those nations and those areas of the world that need time to adjust humanitarian issues to be able to do so.
Okay, thank you very much, Jojo. That's brilliant. Considering you're having a lag and some technical problems, that was great. Thank you so much. Got a question here for Esther. Which I thought was very interesting. Lost it now.
Is it the one about the Green New Deal?
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much. Would you mind reading? Would you mind taking over chair? Could you read that out, Esther, and then answer that? That would be fantastic. Thank you.
Which I've lost as well, but I did answer it I did answer it, but I've lost it too. So it was really something like, does the Green New Deal, is it aligned with this, and does it add traction, help to add traction? And my basic response was, it helps to add the traction. It's not perfectly aligned, and it's not totally sufficient in terms of, I mean, there are many different initiatives happening under that sort of umbrella of the Green New Deal. And what I felt was important was that the greening and of society, and therefore that would include higher recognition of matters such as ecocide and so forth, that happening in sort of the global north largely shouldn't be done in a way that actually harmfully impacts on communities of resistance in the global south and indigenous peoples. So without looking at this in a local way, so the global implications of even, you know, local national policies that we're being taken that might look progressive, then we might actually end up, you know, doing further harm as opposed to being part of the repair. So that was my basic answer.
Thank you so much. It probably, yes, it obviously disappeared, didn't it? Once answered, that's why I couldn't find it. But thank you for helping me out of the hole. There's just one question, I just want to sneak in really quickly, because I know we are supposed to finish, but it's one that's close to my heart, and it's from Samantha Orenstein. Does the new incoming environment bill offer any hope in this issue? And I would imagine that's probably quite a quick one to answer. Would anybody like to say anything on that?
It's an English bill, so I know nothing about it. I think basically the answer is no. It's trying to bring over, in a way, the European control of the environment to an organisation in Britain that will cover the same sorts of things, but it's not really expanding the concept of what you should protect. And just if I could answer a question which I unfortunately deleted by mistake, somebody asked me, is the personality for rivers appropriate in Britain, which has a totally different cultural concept to where it is. It's been given in countries where the indigenous communities have always had a spiritual association with the rivers. I think it's equally applicable in Britain, because at the sort of local level, people do have this sort of cultural association. It's been killed to an extent, really, because we've gone into the property scheme of things. The river is owned by all the riparian owners, subject to their mutual rights to receive the water as it has always flowed. But I think there's a proposal to give Ben Nevis a personality, because it has that sort of concept in its local community. But thank you.
Thank you very much. There's so many interesting themes we could run and run, but I just noticed that in fact we're slightly even supposed to have closed and we've gone a minute over. So unfortunately, I think we're going to have to close. I don't know whether we can still try and get to some of the questions in writing, perhaps if that's possible afterwards. But I just think I need to finally close by just giving an enormous thank you to the three speakers who did very well against kind of slight technical hitches as well. We were so pleased to have you with us, and your contributions have been so insightful and interesting. So thank you to Sir Crispin, to Esther and to Jojo. I'd also just quickly like to thank the Green Committee whose idea this was and who've done all the work behind it, and they've helped me to run it and they've been fantastic. So thank you very much for that. And thank you to all of you for joining. I think I'm right in saying this has possibly been the webinar that we've had the highest number of registers and attendance for, which is fantastic because it actually means I've beaten my husband's record, which is even better. So thank you very much for joining. Thank you for your interest in the topic, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.